Thousand Davis, White Eye. She's inclusion, diversity, Aboriginal American.
Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome. Greetings to our Fielding Critical Conversations that cover the intersection between reflective engagement and global inclusion. I am Allison Davis White-Eyes, and I currently serve as the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at Fielding Graduate University. Today's event is particularly important as we are quickly coming upon the eve of the 60th quadrennial presidential election for the United States. Discussions about whether democracy functions as a system and is truly representative have become embedded themes in our current national discourse. At Fielding, there have been a number of conversations with students regarding this very topic. I would like to thank the students who were in Dr. Rosa Cho's course on structural inequalities that broached this topic and inspired this panel. According to the Pew Research Center, 72% of Americans say the United States used to be a good example of democracy, but is not anymore. As regards the world community, they too have a similar assessment of democracy. Today will be an opportunity to unpack some of those thoughts, observations, questions, and concerns. Some of the key issues that have recently been raised include the following. First, for the majority of us, that democracy is in crisis is now broadly recognized, but what are the key causes of this crisis, the major fault lines? This is our task and commitment as scholar practitioners to draw on scholarship for an accurate diagnosis and then to identify what needs to be done. Second, how did we descend so quickly to this perilous place in which would-be autocrats are undermining the foundations of American democracy and this project? How, in other words, do we explain acquiescence? Third, what can we learn from other nations, such as Hungary, in which a popularly elected leader in a nation with reasonably well-informed democratic systems managed within a few years to turn it into an autocracy? Last, what needs to be done to repair and renovate democracy? What can we, in this learning community, do to raise awareness of the current peril and prepare to take a more active role in the repair and reinvention process? What can we do individually in our communities and also working with national initiatives that serve as active agents of change, defending the higher ideals of our country? To that end, I would like to introduce our amazing panelists for today's event. Joining us today are Dr. John Dedrick, who currently serves as the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Kettering Foundation, an organization committed to advancing thriving and inclusive democracies around the world. Dr. Laurence Habib, Professor and Head of the Department of Computer Science at the Faculty of Technology, Art and Design at Oslo Metropolitan University, Norway. Dr. Philip Kneis, faculty at Oregon State University School of Public Policy. Dr. Keith Melville, Fielding faculty member since 1983, who has worked with the White House and was a writer and staff member of the President's Commission for a National Agenda. He has worked with the former Secretary of State Cyrus Vance at the New York-based Public Agenda. Dr. Melville also serves as a senior associate at the Kettering Foundation. And Dr. Katrina Rogers. Dr. Rogers is the current president of Fielding Graduate University and has worked with the European campus for Thunderbird School of Global Management in Geneva, Switzerland, and has also worked with a number of international organizations, such as the Red Cross, the World Trade Organization, and the United Nations Development Program. She currently serves on the boards of the Toda Institute for Global Policy and Peace Research and the Public Dialogue Consortium. Again, thank you, panelists. As we move into our program, I would like to ask that each of you place your microphones on mute so that we can hear the conversation. I would also like to ask that you place your questions in the chat, which will be moderated by Kaylin Staten. We will be taking questions at the end of the panelists' presentations. Please note that I have dropped into the chat some resources, which include the Pew Research Center's surveys to give you some background and also a link to the Kettering Foundation. With that, let's begin with the current state of democracy. Dr. Melville, would you please share the current state of democracy in the United States? How do you understand our current political landscape? And what are the major fault lines, the challenges, and the opportunities? Dr. Melville. You'll need to unmute yourself.
There we are. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you, old friends and new friends and colleagues. What a moment to have this conversation. I mean, I'd be willing to bet that decades from now, people will ask you what you were doing a week before this election. As we all know, there is no question that it's a major turning point. It seems to me that if, I'm anxious, if you're not anxious, I'm not sure that you're paying attention to what's going on here. So part of what we want to do is just have an occasion to talk together about both the challenges and the opportunities. Allison just began to tee this up. We want to make sure that it's an easy enough thing and a familiar enough thing to talk about the challenges because you all pay attention. We all pay attention. It's hard to avoid it. We know what the challenges are. I'll just do a brief review of those. But I think what we want to feature is both, among the different panelist presentations, is both a broader lens for understanding the causes of the current dysfunction, and then really move into what can be done and what will need to be done regardless of the outcome of the election next week. So with that, let's just begin perhaps with the most obvious thing, the most current thing. I mean, think of what's happening today and think of what happened on Sunday. What's happening today is that there's a huge gathering on the Mall in which Kamala Harris is basically doing what amounts to her closing speech about her candidacy. What happened on Sunday was, as I'm sure all of you know, because you've been following the news on this, was a gathering in Madison Square Garden in New York of 20,000 people that was absolutely frightening because there were themes, because of the assertions that were made there that were fundamentally anti-democratic, anti-diversity, and that all by themselves summarized a lot of the challenges that the nation faces right now. So the focus at this moment, to say the most obvious thing, is on the election. So I found that I was going through my files thinking about our get-together here, and I found a piece from a week or two ago from Axios, the title of which is "America Braces for a Perfect Storm of Election Chaos. Everywhere you look, signs are mounting of a tinderbox election that will test the outer bounds and breaking points of American democracy, honesty, and civility," which seems to me to be a pretty good summary of where we are on democracy right now. As most of you know from polling, Trump backers are more primed to doubt the election outcome than they were in 2020. So there's every reason to assume that that whatever happens a week from today, what happens over the next 2 months, and 2+ months between now and January 6th, will really test, it'll be a stress test, and almost an unprecedented stress test of the whole system of elections and having trust in election outcomes and the peaceful transfer of power. Let's frame it a little bit more broadly, and that is, as a reminder, there is so much that's been going on over the past few years and increasingly ramping up over the last month or so that is unprecedented, at least in our lifetimes. I think in the lifetimes of every one of us here, we haven't seen or experienced some of the things that we've experienced in the past couple of weeks. The United States has never before had a felon running for president. We've never had a president or a presidential candidate explicitly laying out the intention of authoritarian rule. We've never had an ex-president or somebody vying to be our next president who has such clear disdain for the Constitution. So I could go on, but again, most of you are so familiar with this, it still is so new that it's difficult to take in just what a fundamental break this is in terms of a common ground about democratic norms. I don't know if you all have been following, in particular, the writings of Anne Applebaum. Allison mentioned her name just a moment ago. She, I think, is one of the most acute writers about what's going on now. There's a piece that came out, a week or so ago in the Atlantic, the title of which is "Trump is Speaking Like Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini." And the whole back and forth, again, that we're all familiar with about whether it's accurate to use the word fascist with regard to ex-President Trump. Anne Applebaum also wrote another piece that I'd like to come back to later in our hour. The danger is greater than in 2020. Be prepared. It's a citizen's guide to the 2024 election. We'll share the citation with you. It helps to move toward what we can do. But again, just staying on these broad characterizations for just a moment and looking at polls, what's particularly distressing is that, according to one poll, 81% of voters believe democracy is threatened. More than half of Americans believe that the United States is a poorly functioning democracy. Only 28% of Americans are satisfied with the way democracy is working. And what seems particularly striking to me is that Americans are more dissatisfied with our government than are the people in any other democratic nation. That's quite striking. Philippe will help us in a couple of minutes by laying out some of the implications of the fact that the erosion of democracy is a global phenomenon. Again, as all of you know, there are lots of implications of this in terms of how we understand what's happening to American democracy and how much of it needs to be dealt with as a structural matter, which sounds like kind of a more formal discussion than normally takes place in the media.
Thank you, Dr. Melville. We're going to segue now to global perspectives. Thank you for raising up Dr. Kanais. Dr. Kanais, given the current situation in Hungary and Eastern Europe, as well as the recent German elections, would you please share with us the current global context regarding democracy and the rise of authoritarian rhetorics? And how does this rise of authoritarian movements influence the state of democracy in the U.S.?
Yes, hello. Thank you very much. I put the PowerPoint up. Can you really? I hope everybody can see it.
Yes.
And I also, because there's a lot of text in here, I don't want to read everything. I put the PowerPoint in the chat. So as we all know, we have a little bit of a problem with Europe with elections. Europe is never a good place where that phenomenon should be making anybody feel happy. This broad overview shows how much of a success of extreme right-wing candidates in elections we actually see. There's typically a split that we assume between Eastern and Western Europe. That split isn't quite visible because Germany needs to be seen still as two. East and West Germany are a little bit dissimilar here. Every one of those countries shares one problem: unregulated immigration, which has been a problem that Europe hasn't been able to fix. With that, I also mean the integration of people and the communication that actually Europe needs immigration and why these people come to Europe. You also have, for longest time, a reliance on Russian oil and gas, and that may explain some of Viktor Orban's policies in Hungary. Austria also very much more in the pro-Putin camp, but that has to do with resources, oftentimes. In the case of Orban, you have the word illiberal democracy that he likes to use for his government. Behind that stands, of course, xenophobia, but also a systematic corruption trend. Overall, American perceptions on European countries are a little bit too rosy when it comes on immigration and whether they are all model examples for liberalism. That is not necessarily always the case. In Germany, which is what I'm focusing on in the moment, I would say there are no immediate concerns, but there are some ties between, ironically, the Social Democratic Party through Volkswagen being strong in Lower Saxony, being indebted a little bit to China, and also reliance on Russian oil and gas, which the previous government really pushed. And so all of this gives a material background to that, but there is also a trend overall that the traditional party system in European countries has declined. Social Democrats, these are the graphs here as an example, are especially threatened, but old Christian democratic parties have even disappeared. Yeah, Democrazia Cristiana in Italy is gone. And we know that the party system everywhere is being reshuffled, especially on the far right. We have new parties coming up. In Germany, we've had for a while the so-called Alternative for Germany, which is a party that started out as a party skeptical of euro currency problems, but they have shifted into a more neo-fascist side. I can say that because one of its main people can legally be called a fascist in German media. We've had recently also, actually this year, the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht, Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, that was created as a spin-off from the former Communist Party, but they are espousing extreme right and left positions. You can see how both parties have risen in recent polls and elections, and also the European elections have set a strong showing of both. And you've had a very interesting alliance in ideas between both of a pro-Russia, anti-Ukraine, pro-Putin platform, anti-illegal immigration or anti-immigration proper, both kind of tied together eventually. A focus on so-called traditional values, which means, of course, anti-LGBTQ, and whatever hides against anti-woke. Also a resistance to climate change measures, which has driven up prices for many people. Of course, the denial of climate change because you don't want people to see the necessity of that. Anti-NATO and a cult of leadership. What is immediately concerning is that in recent elections in 2 East German states, young people voted overwhelmingly for extremist parties. I count the former communists under them. So AfD, Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, and Left Party in Saxony over 50%, Thuringia 62%. On the other hand, the real concerns that people have are very similar to those that we all know. But the problem, I would say, is all these issues that may be legitimate, some may be less so, are not really talked about or solved by democratic parties. In many ways, they have failed communicating, and that has not helped the rise of the extremes. Of course, demagogues are happily mining these fields of real crises, and then they amp up other crises.
Thank
So the
you,
crisis of
Professor.
democracy, we will put some resources out, and I put the PowerPoint in there for more details. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kneis. And as we think about national and international contexts regarding democracy, how do you see technology and AI shaping democratic processes, Dr. Habib? And what ethical considerations should we keep in mind as we navigate this new political ecosystem?
And thank you. I'm honored to be here to talk about the role of AI in shaping the democratic process. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, I want to start with a note a positive note, and I'd like to say that there's a lot of potential for AI to promote democracy. For example, there's all sorts of AI-powered tools that can help people find out what their candidates or other candidates stand for. That can be a game changer for people who feel disconnected with politics. And then AI, we know, has this amazing ability to synthesize huge amounts of text, and that can be used for public consultations, for example. However, there's a flip side, and that's AI can be a threat to democracy. Now, when I say that, most people start thinking about how AI is used to interfere with elections. And definitely we've seen some of this. We've seen it with the robocall with Biden's voice in January in New Hampshire, and it's being used all over the world. What I'd like to talk about more is our daily democratic dialogue that's also eroding. It might be tough to hear, but many people are overwhelmed with the news. And then they rely on bite-sized pieces of information. And in the so-called attention economy, where every content provider is fighting with each other to get our attention, then it's no surprise that people are noticing more the news that are surprising, that are entertaining, or just that are over the top. So this algorithmic shaping of information, what it means is that the content that you see is based on what you've looked at before and what you've liked. So it's like an echo of your previous likes and your previous views. So talking about echo chambers, they've probably always existed, but now they're bigger and then they're louder. And they make it so much more difficult for us to get exposed to genuinely challenging perspectives that challenge our core beliefs. So we gradually lose our ability for critical thinking. And then there's the risk of manipulation through political micro-targeting. That's because we happily give away our behavioral data each time we click on I accept, in order to get free services or cheap services. So these data can be used to sell us products, but it can also be used to manipulate our opinions. We all know how those large language models like ChatGPT, how good they are at creating texts that look like good language. I mean, that's good language and that's convincing. And you can imagine how it can be tailored to our fears. It can be tailored to our worries. It can be tailored to our hopes. And those fears and worries and hopes, they are not that difficult to infer from our behavior, our online behavior, because you can just see at what we've been watching, how long we've been watching it, what we've been commenting on, what we've been liking, not commenting, and all this is very important data that can be used to manipulate us. Now, we all know the damages that are caused by fakes. Even more troubling for us is the indirect effect of misinformation, because they're a lot more subtle. The big risk, I think, is that people will not know what to believe. So just to wrap up, I will borrow those words from Tony Blair from the 90s when he was asked what's the top three priorities. And he said, it's education, education, and education. I'd say the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Habib. Excellent, thank you. And as we think about the role of technology in democracy, we can't separate that from the role of higher education. President Rogers, what is the role of higher education in shaping our understanding of democracy? What are the challenges and opportunities for higher education during these polarizing times? And we cannot hear you. I don't know if you're on mute.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you, colleagues, for this opportunity, and for all of you who are here today. I already can see the contours of a conversation about to happen. So I'm starting off by, I want to talk a little bit about the irony of democracy. I used to teach American politics to undergraduate students, and I would stand in front of 90 students every day, twice a day, 5 days a week, and talk about how the American political system worked. And one textbook I used was called The Irony of Democracy. This phrase was coined by Thomas Dreier and colleagues to point out that democracy is government that's by the people, as we like to say, but the survival of it rests on the shoulders of elites. And that's one of the ironies of democracy. Elites must govern wisely if government by the people is to survive. That is, when you think about it, masses do not lead. Elites have to govern wisely if it's going to survive. The masses may respond. We respond to attitudes and proposals and behaviors. And the theory is masses can't lead for impractical reasons. I mean, think of recent social movements like Occupy Wall Street, for example. They were proud to be leaders, but over time, they tend to dissipate. Another reason that masses cannot lead is because they often don't know really how governance works. The negotiation, the compromise, how democratic processes tend to be inefficient. That's why populism is such a threat to democracy. It's a position that can claim to speak for the people against the elite, whoever those elites are defined, but it can be used for specific goals. It often is a compelling mask that obfuscates anti-democratic objectives, which is what we're seeing here in the United States. The second irony of democracy in the US is that we're founded based on a system of slavery, which is based on the forced and unpaid labor of some peoples and the theft and eradication of some peoples. That's both people of color, Africans, African Americans who became African Americans, indigenous communities in our land. The United States was created at least in part by a group that was fleeing a colonial power only to become a colonial power. So here we sit in contemporary times in an inconvenient truth that our democracy has lofty ideals and aspirations set within a complex and unjust past. One of these lofty ideals is the role of education in ensuring a democracy, the lofty ideals set out by one of our founders, as well as many others, Thomas Jefferson. In 1818, he wrote, "To give to every citizen the information they need to understand their duties, to their neighbors, their country, to know their rights." This is a radical idea at the time. Jefferson believed that educated citizens were the only way, the only means by which American experiment in self-government would succeed. And he proposed a system of broad, free, public education and put this into practice by founding the University of Virginia as just one thing that he did. From that time forward until the present, the US education system is seen as one of the best in the world, and it's been a strong pillar of American democracy, and I would argue needs to continue to be so. And it's a system that attempts to provide everyone in the country a foundational education. So a book that I co-authored with another college president, we interviewed colleges about what citizenship education looks like, and these here on the slide are the top responses. And as you look at this list, thank you, Allison, I'm almost done. As you look at this list, you may be thinking that these tools are not meeting the moment, this moment where people who are polled believe that the US is in democratic crisis, but this is critical. They're not seeing the same crisis. I think that we're going to come back to this in our conversation, so I won't belabor the point. What I would like to say is that I suggest that part of the seeds of our current battle is that we haven't really come to terms with our colonialism and our colonial past, and that they continue to haunt us. And one of the ways that we see this is in immigration, the perception of immigration and global migration, which is a direct effect of colonialism. And until we really reconcile these very different stories that we have about immigration and the role of immigration in this country as good, bad, indifferent, the perceptions, they will always be used to fuel populist movements. So I would just conclude with one thing with this last slide. What is to be done? I would suggest that in the model that we saw in the research and in the book that we wrote, Interviewing College Presidents, this current model, these are all things we can and should do. There's no question. In addition, I think for education, the new model needs to teach the legacies of democracy to everyone in every forum possible, that we need to always be providing the global context and history, which some of my colleagues today have already mentioned. And we have to always make the case for a pluralistic democracy, because that is the only way to both overcome our history and to continue what I think is the grandest experiment of history, of world history, which is American democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, President Rogers, and thank you for naming pluralistic democracy, which is indeed one of our strengths. And this is a great segue to questioning of Dr. Dedrick, who serves as the Executive Vice President for the Kettering Foundation. The Kettering Foundation has a very unique mission in advancing and defending inclusive democracy. Dr. Dedrick, would you please share a little bit more about that, and what might be some of the, as you look ahead, what are some of the emerging challenges that might be involved in that, and what's being done?
Thank you, Dr. White Eyes. It's absolutely terrific to be part of the conversation this afternoon, and it couldn't be more timely, as you said in the opening. As Dr. White Eyes Davis said, we're an operating research foundation based in Dayton, Ohio. We work locally, nationally, and globally, and our mission is to advance inclusive democracies by fostering citizen engagement, promoting government accountability, and countering authoritarianism. And we think those three need to go together. What I want to do now is talk about some, as just been indicated, some things that are emergent or before us and what they may mean for folks that are involved in funding communities. A number of dilemmas we face. One, we have on the one hand, substantial evidence of citizen acquiescence to authoritarian, sympathetic type of candidates. And on the other hand, a growing awareness of threats to democracy. They both exist at the same time. Two, we have, along with acquiescence to non-democratic candidates, we have large numbers of people who have been activated in social movements around Black Lives Matter, climate, reproductive rights, and especially activated young people. And we have a history of fairly strong institutions. They've been tested and will be tested very severely, as other panelists have indicated, nationally and globally in the coming period. In the field where I work, in philanthropy, there is, on the notion of growing awareness of the threats to democracy, a rather remarkable growth of number of funders and dollars being invested in pro-democracy work. For example, the Affinity Group and Council on Foundations Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement now has over 70 members who are working on issues around bridging, citizen engagement, role of our civil society and faith organizations, focused largely on citizen-centered approaches. The longstanding Funders Committee for Civic Participation at this point has over 120 funders involved. So there's a growing networks within organized philanthropy for pro-democracy activities. There are also networks developing like the New Pluralist, which is a cross-ideological network trying to make the case for pluralistic democracy that President Rogers noted. and field-wide efforts like the American Academy of Social Sciences, Our Common Purpose study, which involved a number of funders and civic groups. In addition to the funders world, I want to point out, if I can do this, two maps. One, this is from the National Civic League, and it's a new mapping project that they have launched this fall, trying to identify as many civic organizations and networks of civic organizations in the country as they can. And already, having looked at 20 states, they've identified 2,700 organizations that constitute 17 major networks. So there is, in terms of an activated citizenry, a growing infrastructure for that. And then the next thing I want to note here is some work that Keith Melville has done, trying to map who is doing what vis-a-vis the democracy domain. And what we'll see on this map is, on the left, a number of groups that are involved in citizen-centered work, and on the right, groups focused on institutional democratic reform. The two vectors, if you will, or two quadrants, are complementary and overlap in some places. A recent study conducted by the Democracy Fund Voter Study Group, published in January this year, has documented, on the funding side of these organizations, a growth of funding between 2018 of $4.3 billion and 2022 of $6.9 billion. And they have also identified, in their survey of 70 organizations, an overwhelming interest on the right-hand side of this equation around voting, elections, social justice, and media policy. So there's significant work and opportunities to be done on the citizen side. And I think that's where we're largely focused at Kettering. I want to end with a couple of quotes, because our work for more inclusive democracy is set in the context of a time when there are way too many efforts to make our democracy less inclusive. In a wonderful book titled Four Threats by Susan Lederman and Robert Lieberman, they talk about formative rifts that are especially difficult in society, and those involve often race, gender, and identity. And John Powell, the founder of the Belonging Institute, has written that the problem of the 21st century is othering, and the only viable solution is one that involves inclusion and belonging. And that brings us back to Dr. Rogers' points about not only teaching the legacy of democracy and owning the word democracy, but putting our own democracy in a global context and understanding that othering and exclusion rather than inclusion undermine democracy, not only here, but everywhere.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dedrick. And at this time, I want to thank each and every one of our panelists and really open this up for the fielding community to drop in some questions or anything that is coming to mind.
Dr. Davis White Eyes, we do have one comment from Dr. June Klein, and I'll just go ahead and read it verbatim. It seems like critical thinking and dialogic thinking are not being reinforced in the places where people, especially young people, get their news. I wonder what we as educators can do to help the next generation who is voting for the first time to rise above the technology that is driving narrow views to their devices. So I'll open it up to our panelists. Whoever would like to answer that, which I have an idea of maybe who would like to answer it, but we'll give the panelists an opportunity.
And please raise your hand, panelists, so we know who to call on. Dr. Kneis.
Thank you, Dr. Klein. I think especially the dialogical thinking is not emphasized because we are not learning to listen to each other. And we are not learning either to, I mean, I think that's a new word I've learned, to steel man the opposition's argument. We are reducing every conversation to, I represent the best of my side and contrast it with the worst of your side. We are no longer daring to have students say, present the best argument for the position you don't share. And the more we try to make that position, it's an old-fashioned position to understand what we are against, the less and less we know how to do that, the more perplexed we are about what arguments the other sides have. I mean, those on the left don't understand that the right is afraid of left-wing authoritarianism and vice versa. Yeah, and that's why I really like President Rogers when he said we are not seeing the same crisis. That is exactly the description of where we are in.
Thank you, Dr. Knies. Dr. Melville.
Yes, several of my fellow panelists here have just mentioned the importance of education, and of course it raises fundamental questions for educators in general about what kind of civic education would help 21st century citizens to both be alert to the problems of approaching anti-democratic leaders, and also to respond to that. And I just, in the writing and the seminars that some of us have been in together, I just keep wondering whether the current generation of students has a sufficient understanding of some constitutional basics, like what in the world checks and balances might mean, about what the importance of seeing and being alert to actions that are really fundamentally contrary to the constitutional provisions and so forth. And what keeps going through my mind is that education hasn't been very effective historically in preventing the rise of autocratic movements. The Weimar Republic, if you recall, in the 1930s was the best educated nation in the world. And it didn't in any way prepare that country to push back against the early Nazi movement. So I really think that as educators, and many of us in various roles are educators, need to think very seriously about what would it mean to recommit to a revitalized civic education for the 21st century that would really prepare students not only to recognize the threat, but also to participate in new ways. So that's a big challenge, both in general for educators and specifically for us in fielding, to really examine what we're doing collectively, and how, in that sense, we might really be an important part of the pushback against anti-democratic forces.
Thank you, Dr. Melville. Halen, other questions?
Or we have some coming into the chat. And so Dr. Laura Black says that the young people I work with, even those who are very open to dialogic thinking, are exhausted and feel like their voices do not matter. This is a different kind of crisis than being polarized. How do you promote a sense of empowerment for disenfranchised young folks?
Analysts, thoughts on that? Yeah, it looks like Dr. Melville.
If I could just begin a response to that, it seems to me as if there's not a very clear sense among the younger generation as to what they can do to push back, and that some of the things that are the most prominent forms of civic engagement, voting, participating in various kinds of demonstrations and so on and so forth, are not really effective or seen to be effective as a way of addressing some of the fundamental flaws in democracy. So just to start this, I think it would be an excellent thing to start emphasizing more. What are those specific things that citizens can do and that the younger generation could do particularly to address the problems in democracy?
Thank you.
I want to go back to something that Dr. Dedrick said, which is he pointed out how many networks there are activated, and there are those specifically for younger adults and younger voters. And I think you can also see this across college campuses in the undergraduate space. So although that's late, right, we want civic education younger than that. There are a number of efforts that you can find out about online, and it would take a few minutes to find some of those resources, but there are lots of information, toolkits, ways to energize younger voters and younger people to the notion of what it means to be a democratic citizen.
Thank you. Kaylin, I think we have a question from Provost Williams.
We do. So Provost Williams put in the chat, given the growing number of anti-democratic governments as highlighted by Dr. Knies in regard to European countries, as well as the recent proposal by the BRICS nations for a digital or alternative currency with the primary aim of reducing dependence on the US dollar, what thoughts might our colleagues have about how to think about combating the twin ideological and economic efforts working against modern democracy?
Dr. Knies.
Thank you for the question. I want to combine it with an answer to the previous question. A lot of the reasons why young people go to the extremes is that on the extreme, those political parties seem to still be open to new voices. It is very difficult for a young person to get into an existing political party and being heard. Oftentimes they're treated as, well, you don't know anything, let me teach you the ways. And that condescension is oftentimes part of the problem. And so they are being attracted by those who say there's an alternative to how we do things. And this alternative is also presented by the BRICS countries. But once we educate people that, well, okay, Brazil is democratic, India is democratic, but China and Russia are not. So for young people to think that they would have a better future, self-determined in countries where they cannot be listened to at all, that is oftentimes something they don't understand. And we are, of course, having to criticize and to critically look at our history and what the United States has done. But we also need to educate people more about the other countries in the world, how different systems work differently, and how they may have opportunities here to utter such criticism of our own country that would not be possible in other countries. We are sometimes, I think, focusing more on critiquing what we have, which is a necessary activity to do because we have to overcome our own failings. But we sometimes communicate that this is the worst place for people ever, which comparatively is not necessarily the truth. So there needs to be a way to putting this criticism within context. And that is fueling a lot of the conservative backlash where people then don't want to talk about problems in our country anymore. They said, you know, our country isn't that bad, don't talk about problems. I think we have to find a way of talking about problems, but also having a global outlook, which is why I'm really thankful that we could talk about some global problems here, because that is something we don't do enough. People are isolated in their bubble.
Thank you, Dr. Knies. Kaylin, we have a few other questions in the chat, so can we get through some of these? Some of these are very good.
Sure. So Lisa Whited says, this is for Dr. Dedrick specifically. So while I applaud the investments made by funders for the New Pluralist Initiative, how do we ever have a chance with the billions of dollars from Elon Musk being poured into the extreme right?
Big question. The way I think about this is infrastructure building. And that what the challenge for the citizen side of democracy is building the infrastructure that will allow for large numbers of people to be involved in high quality relational work, which explicitly has commitments to nonviolence. That's time consuming work. And there's enormous progress on that through efforts like AmeriCorps and the 200,000 plus young people who go through that a year. Enormous work that has gone on over the last decade or plus in building infrastructure of nonprofit organizations and networks of funders, who through their efforts can do work to increase the understanding of the threat of authoritarianism, which is a place to start, who can contribute to creating openings for larger numbers of people to be involved, and to be involved specifically in mechanisms for holding governments accountable. One fact of American life, and I don't really understand this, is that any efforts to deal with money in politics, even aside from Citizens United in the case, is not particularly persuasive to voters. We're all concerned about money in politics, but as an issue that rises to action and policy, it's not proven to be as salient as some others. Long term.
Thank you, Dr. Dedrick. Excellent. Kaylin.
This is more of a comment, but I just want to know if any of the panelists want to expand upon it. But this is from Dr. Regina Tuma. Keith's comment about education, Arendt's essay on education. The purpose of education is to nurture the sixth sense, common sense, the sense that allows for synthesis and possibly reflection. Unfortunately, educational landscape is moving away from the kind of education needed for democracy. So does anybody have any extra thoughts on that piece?
Keith, Dr. Keith.
Kaylin, I'd be happy to comment on that. Just partly to call attention to what I think we already know, and that is it's extremely difficult for educators to talk candidly and teach candidly about what's happening now, precisely because in one role we are obliged to be nonpartisan. So that virtually textbook publishers, for example, cannot publish candid accounts of the threat posed by the Trump movement, because any instructors or universities that use those texts would be immediately charged as engaging in partisan activities, and their funding would be threatened. So that's a very difficult challenge to deal with. We haven't had that problem before that I can recall in quite in that sense. I mean, in a sense, we had that with McCarthyism, but there was a different situation. So just to call attention to what the nature of the challenge is for us as educators, how to talk, and especially educators that are in publicly funded institutions, about the current political climate and the threat of authoritarian regimes in a way that doesn't immediately attract a blowback from far-right groups and politicians.
Thank you, Dr. Melville. Looks like President Rogers would like to add to that.
Thank you, Dr. Davis White Eyes. I just want to say something that we know from history. Democracies tend to be inefficient. They're inefficient forms of government because there's give and take and compromise and negotiation and so on. And things take a long time to work in a democracy. Authoritarian governments can be much more directive. They're like command and control organizations, but they tend to be far more unstable. And the reason is that they are often driven by the cult of personality that then creates an infrastructure and a system. But ultimately, authoritarianism does not sustain itself. What you'll notice, maybe McCarthyism is maybe not the best example, but it is an example. When McCarthy was defeated, the energy went out of the movement. Now it did sublimate, and we're still these threads and forces in democracy, in every democracy, as my colleague pointed out. So the hope I have is that we're in a moment. The question is now, but the also question is in the future, when there's a realization, when the energy drains out of the authoritarian movement, that's the time for reconciliation. That's the time when we have to have all of the things in place to begin to build consensus and bridges again, to not continue the polarization. Societies have done it. Rwanda did it. The countries in the Balkans did it. It can be done, but it takes intentionality and an understanding of the long view. And that's what I have hoped for. This is just the moment.
Thank you, President Rogers. I know we're getting at time and we have so many wonderful and amazing comments and reflections in the chat and simply not enough time. What I want to say right now is that as part of our fielding critical conversations and our commitment to an inclusive democracy, that we plan on having a series of these conversations moving forward. And we would kindly ask that you join us in these conversations. We will be hosting another session post-election because we imagine that there will be, hopefully, someone announced, and we will be in a different place, in a different space, and we will be looking forward to what our next 4 years will be looking like. So we hope to share that with the fielding community and to engage in a conversation with you about that. But as we come to a close in the few minutes we have remaining, I would like Dr. Melville to give us some suggestions about what we can do in this moment. And then we will close out our session. So Dr. Melville, your thoughts.
Thank you, Alison. Just very briefly, whenever I verge on despair about our political situation, I take energy and optimism from the pro-democracy group. I think it's very important to recognize, as Don Dedrick was saying a couple of moments ago, how many efforts have started and how much creative energy is going into that and what it would take to, I keep thinking about the environmental movement that started when? Back in the 1970s. How does a movement get started that actually takes on scale so that it has impact? We should be asking the same question about the pro-democracy movement. What would it take to build on the efforts that are taking place now in order that they move to scale and have political impact? I mean, one of the things that's perfectly clear is that they, elected officials, will not make the structural changes that need to be made to deal with what's wrong with the American Democracy Project. We have to apply the pressure and the support and the strategies to make that happen. So that's why I think there's a huge opportunity here for education and for creative efforts to really move into this space and say, okay, after the election, no matter what the outcome of that election is, we've got this generational task of rebuilding democracy, the repair and reinvention project. That will happen one way or another. The question is how effective it is. And the question is what role we will play, I will play, you will play in doing that. So I think that's the challenge for us. And it's a big job. But among other institutions, fielding is ideally placed with a commitment for scholar practitioners to take an active role here. It's in our DNA as an institution. It goes way back to Halleck Hoffman, and one of the founders of this program, who started his whole career at the Center for the Advancement of Democracy here in Santa Barbara. So I think there are lots of challenges and lots of reasons for optimism about how to move forward and really deal with the substantial threats that we've been talking about here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keith Melville, and a special thank you to each of our panelists, as well as to our amazing fielding community that shows up with love, authenticity, courage, and empathy. That is fielding. So glad to have you join us, and we look forward to having you joining us after 2025. We will be reconvening these conversations for an advancing and inclusive democracy. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank
Thank you
all.
so much. Thank you.